Coles Creek, Illinois, Thanksgiving Day. A woman is walking into a war she already won. The farmhouse smells of roasted turkey and old secrets, a warmth that tries to mask the rot underneath. And my name is Adalynn Cole. I am walking up the drive with a bottle of wine in one hand and a manila envelope in the other, stepping toward a family that spent 20 years trying to erase me. They have set a place for me at the edge of the table, expecting my silence. They do not know that by the time the pumpkin pie is served, I will strip them of the one thing they value more than blood. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. If you had been watching me walk up the long gravel driveway to my parents' farmhouse that afternoon, you wouldn't have seen anything out of the ordinary. It was a crisp gray November day in the Midwest, the kind that smells like wood smoke and dried leaves. The house stood on a hill overlooking the sprawling lot of Cole Hauling and Fabrication, the company that had effectively built this town and fed half the families in it. From the outside, I looked like any other dutiful daughter returning from the big city for Thanksgiving dinner. I had a bottle of wine in one hand and a polite frozen smile on my face. But to me, walking through those front doors felt less like a holiday gathering and more like stepping onto a crime scene moments before the crime actually took place. The only difference was that the victim wasn't going to be a body on the floor, it was going to be an illusion. By the end of the night, I knew I would strip my family of the one thing they thought I could never touch. My name is Adalynn Cole. Back in Chicago, I'm a financial analyst. I spend my days tearing apart balance sheets, finding the bleeding wounds in failing companies, and deciding if they can be stitched up or if they need to be put down. I'm good at it because I learned early on to watch for the things people don't say. My boyfriend Chris, an EMT who saves lives while I save bank accounts, always tells me I have a terrifying ability to see the crash before the cars even collide. He was right. That's exactly what I was doing as I wiped my boots on the welcome mat. I was watching a crash that had been 20 years in the making. Inside the house was warm and smelled of roasted turkey and sage, a comforting scent that masked the rot underneath. My mother Ruth was fluttering between the kitchen and the dining room, her entire existence dedicated to the preservation of an image. "Adalynn, you made it," she chirped, offering a cheek for a quick air-filled kiss. She didn't ask how I was, or about Chris, or my job. She just checked my coat for lint and pointed me toward the living room. "Go say hello to your father, and Dylan is holding court by the fireplace." There they were. Leonard Cole, my father, a man made of stubbornness and old diesel fumes, who believed a legacy could only be carried by a son. And Dylan, my older brother, holding a whiskey glass, wearing a blazer that looked expensive, but fit him poorly. He was charming, I'll give him that, but he wore his entitlement like a heavy cologne. I walked past them nodding and felt the familiar cold slide of invisibility. It wasn't new, it started when I was 7 years old. My grandfather Everett Cole, the founder, used to sneak me out to the loading docks. He'd lift me onto a forklift and explain the margins of a haul, why every mile and every bolt mattered. I loved the grease and the logic of it. But then Leonard would arrive guiding a young, disinterested Dylan by the shoulder. "Not for you, Addie," my father would say, gently shoving me toward the house while he tried to force Dylan to care about logistics. "Go help your mother. This is business." Over the years, that gentle shove turned into a wall. They didn't just exclude me, they tried to erase me from the narrative of the company entirely. Tonight was the culmination of that erasure. I walked into the dining room to check the table settings. It wasn't just family tonight. The church elders were here along with 3 of the senior drivers and the owner of the local hardware chain. This was a staged event. I scanned the long mahogany table. At the head was Leonard's chair. To his immediate right, the seat of honor was a card printed with Dylan. And there, way down at the far end, past the cousins and the second-tier guests, was a card that said, Adalynn. The physical distance was a perfect map of their emotional sidelining. "Still crunching numbers in the city, Addie?" I turned to see Mr. Henderson, a local banker, swirling his drink. His tone was dripping with that specific brand of small-town condescension reserved for women who leave. "Yes, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice steady. "Audit and strategy." "Cute," he chuckled. "You must love your little spreadsheets, though nothing beats getting your hands dirty like your brother, right?" I looked over at Dylan, whose hands were manicured and had never touched a wrench in his life. The old shame tried to rise up in my throat, that burning desire to scream, "I know more than he does." But I pushed it down. I wasn't that little girl on the loading dock anymore. I was a weapon they hadn't bothered to inspect. We all took our seats. The air was thick with expectation. I sat at the kids' table, essentially watching the power dynamic play out at the other end. My father stood up, tapping a spoon against his crystal wine glass. The room fell silent. He looked at Dylan with a pride that was entirely unearned, then swept his gaze over the room, letting it slide right over me as if I were a ghost. "I have an announcement to make about the future of the Cole name," Leonard rumbled, his voice full of gravity. I folded my hands in my lap. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of polite disinterest. They really still believed they got to narrate my role in this family. They thought tonight was a coronation. I watched my father inhale, ready to speak, and thought, "Go ahead, tell your story. Because tonight I'm going to show you what happens when the person you try to erase finally picks up the pen." To understand why I sat in that dining room silently plotting the downfall of my own father's reign, you have to understand that leaving that town didn't mean I was free. In fact, leaving was the first time I realized just how tight the leash really was. When I was 18, I applied to 3 out-of-state universities, specifically targeting programs known for finance and logistics. I laid the acceptance letters on the kitchen table like a royal flush. Leonard didn't even look up from his newspaper. He told me he wouldn't pay a dime. His logic was brutal and archaic. "Why waste the money, Adalynn? You'll just go out there, find some guy to marry, and forget all this. The business stays here. The money stays here." He thought that would break me. Instead, it radicalized me. I took out loans, applied for every scholarship I could find, and moved to Chicago with 2 suitcases and a burning need to prove him wrong. My mother called it rebellious. I called it survival. The city wasn't easy. I lived in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates and soundproof thin walls, pulling double shifts at a coffee shop and a library just to keep the lights on. But I loved the anonymity. In Chicago, nobody cared that I was a Cole. I was just another face in the crowd, and for the first time, my value was determined by what I could produce, not whose daughter I was. I found mentors who saw what my family refused to see. Dr. Amelia Vaughn, my logistics professor, was a sharp-edged woman who could spot a supply chain bottleneck from a mile away. One afternoon, after I stayed late to debate the efficiency of intermodal shipping lanes, she told me something that became my armor. "Adalynn," she said, tapping her pen on my desk, "people like your father confuse tradition with competence. They think doing things the way they've always been done is the same as doing them well. Don't let them threaten you with nostalgia." I took that to heart. I also met Christian Walker. Chris was a paramedic, the kind of guy who spent his days pulling people out of car wrecks and his nights making sure I remembered to eat. He was the opposite of the men back home. He didn't want to control me, he respected the hustle. He understood that when I was buried in spreadsheets at 200 a.m., I wasn't ignoring him. I was building something. Our relationship reinforced a different kind of American ideal, one of partnership and service, not hierarchy and ego. After graduation, I landed a job at a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in distressed assets, basically the ER for dying companies. I learned the anatomy of failure. I built models late into the night, studying trucking regulations, fuel hedging, and how unions negotiated during bankruptcies. I became obsessed with governance. I started buying single shares of random public companies just so I could get the shareholder packets and learn how to read the fine print that CEOs tried to hide. I was training for a war I didn't know I was going to fight. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was sipping cold coffee, scrolling through a deck of distressed private companies that were potential acquisition targets for one of our venture capital clients. My eyes were glazing over rows of debt-to-equity ratios and liquidity scores. Then I froze. Coal hauling and fabrication. The name on the screen nearly made me drop my mug. I blinked, assuming it was a glitch. It wasn't. I clicked into the file and the blood drained from my face. The numbers were catastrophic. The company, the bedrock of my hometown, the legacy Leonard claimed to be protecting, was drowning. There were loans past due, trucks overdue for critical maintenance, and a note that a major shipper was threatening to void their contract due to reliability issues. The company was on a watch list for potential foreclosure or a fire sale to a massive conglomerate that stripped regional carriers for parts. I panicked. Not for Leonard, but for the town. If coal hauling went under, 300 families would lose their income. I ran to the stairwell, hands shaking, and dialed my father. "Dad, listen to me," I said the moment he picked up, skipping pleasantries. "I saw the company on a distressed asset list. The debt structure, it's unsustainable. You're exposed to variable rates that are about to jump. You need to restructure immediately." There was a pause, then a scoff. "Adalynn, you calling to lecture me? You don't understand real business. You're looking at computer screens. I'm looking at trucks. Don't embarrass yourself." "Dad, the bank is shopping your debt," I pleaded. "We've got opportunities you couldn't even imagine." He snapped and hung up. Desperate, I texted Dylan. "Is the company being sold? Dad is in trouble." His reply came 2 minutes later. "Relax, Addie. This is men's business stuff. Don't threaten Dad's reputation with your big city drama. Stay in your lane." I sat alone in my apartment that night, the glow of the city outside my window feeling cold and distant. I stared at the data on my laptop. They were driving the company off a cliff, and their arrogance was the foot on the gas. I realized then that I had two choices. I could do nothing, let the company collapse and watch my hometown turn into a ghost town while my father blamed the economy. Or I could intervene. But if I intervened, I would have to become the villain in their story. I opened a blank spreadsheet. My cursor blinked in the empty white void. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything just to save their pride. If they wanted to erase me, they should have made sure I didn't learn how to read the fine print. I typed a title into the first cell: Project Erase Me Reversal. The first rule of a hostile takeover is that you never strike until your weapon is loaded. I knew my father's arrogance was his shield, but I needed to find the chink in his armor. I spent the next 3 nights pulling old incorporation records, articles of organization, and scanned loan documents from public filings. My eyes burned from the blue light of my monitors, but what I found woke me up faster than a double shot of espresso. My grandfather Everett hadn't built the company as a kingdom for one man. He had built it as a cooperative. He had spread the original shares among the early drivers, dispatchers, and family friends who had helped him lay the first bricks. Leonard had inherited the largest block, sure, but he had never bothered to consolidate the rest. He assumed those minority shareholders were irrelevant ghosts of a past he had moved beyond. I mapped out a capitalization table in my spreadsheet, color-coding every percentage point. Names popped up that I hadn't thought of in 20 years. Marcia Green, the dispatcher who used to sneak me butterscotch candies while my dad was yelling in the other room. Walt Ramirez, the mechanic who let me help with oil changes and taught me the difference between a ratchet and a torque wrench. Cousins scattered across the country who held shares in a trust but hadn't received a Christmas card from Leonard in a decade. I sat back, staring at the screen. This was it. This was the path. But before I made the first call, I hesitated. A heavy, cold stone of guilt settled in my stomach. Was I doing this to save the town, or was I doing this to hurt them? I thought about the layoffs Leonard had bragged about last Christmas, calling them necessary sacrifices, while Dylan bought a new truck. I thought about the kids I went to school with whose families had vanished from town because the company cut their benefits. I realized then that if I let the company fail, I was complicit. If I saved it by taking it, I wasn't the villain, I was the correction. I started with Marcia. She was semi-retired now, living in a small house with pictures of the old depot on the wall. When I called, she sounded surprised, then wary, but her voice softened when I asked about her garden. We talked for 20 minutes before I pivoted to business. I told her the truth, not the whole truth about my plan, but the truth about the company's health. I told her about the safety corners being cut and the looming sale. "He's forgotten us, hasn't he?" she whispered. "He stopped sending the anniversary calendars 3 years ago. Everett never missed a year." When I explained I wanted to buy her shares to protect the depot, she didn't even ask for a price. She just asked if I promised to keep the doors open. She signed the transfer documents electronically that afternoon. Once Marcia fell, the dominoes started to tip. I took a weekend trip, driving 3 hours to a cramped garage where Walt Ramirez was fixing lawnmowers to supplement his pension. He looked tired. When I told him Leonard had pushed him out early to save on severance, his eyes hardened. He signed his shares over to my LLC, grinning as he did it. "Tell your daddy that grease doesn't wash off," he said. I went to a nursing home to visit Doris Hale, the widow of one of the founding drivers. Her room was small and smelled of lavender. She told me Leonard hadn't visited since Everett died. She sold her shares to me simply because, as she put it, "You're the only one who remembers my husband's name." Then there were the cousins. A Zoom call with a cousin in Arizona was the easiest sell of all. He loathed Dylan for childhood bullying that had never been addressed. "Wait so I get paid and Dylan gets humiliated." He laughed. "Where do I sign? I'd do it for free just to watch him squirm." To keep my fingerprints off the gun, I brought in Harper Lynn, a sharp corporate attorney friend in Chicago. She set up a blind LLC to hold the accumulated shares, so that if Leonard checked the registry, he'd just see a generic investment firm name, not Adalynn Cole. We were building a ghost army share by share right under his nose. But the nights were hard. I'd sit at my kitchen table surrounded by transfer agreements, wrestling with the weight of what I was doing. I reread an old journal entry from high school where a teenage Adalynn had scrawled, "They want to erase me so badly they don't mind burning everything down." That was the clarity I needed. My goal wasn't to burn the house down, it was to evict the arsonists. I wanted to keep the company alive but change who it served. It had to be for the workers, for the town, not just for Leonard's pride. After weeks of secret meetings and sleepless nights, I totaled up the percentages. My heart sank. I was at 44%. It was a massive stake, enough to make noise but not enough to control the board. I needed 51% to stop the sale and fire the leadership. I scanned the list of remaining shareholders. There was only one name left, with a block big enough to tip the scales. Caleb "Cal" Donnelly. He was Everett's former partner, a man who had left the company 30 years ago after a brutal shouting match falling out with Leonard. He held 7%. If I got him, I crossed the line. If I didn't, I was just a minority shareholder with a lot of opinions and no power. I sent one final email to an address that hadn't been active in years, and I waited. If Cal said no, I'd have to choose between walking away or going to war with less than a full shield. Days bled into a week with no response from Cal Donnelly. I checked my email so often the refresh icon seemed to burn into my retina. Then on a Tuesday night, my phone rang. The number was blocked. When I answered, a voice like grinding gravel came through. "I was wondering when one of you Coles would finally come crawling." It was Cal. He didn't want an email. He wanted to look me in the eye. The next morning, I drove 4 hours into the misty hills of southern Illinois. Cal lived in a lakeside cabin that looked like it had grown out of the earth, surrounded by overgrown pines. The interior was a museum of a time my father had tried to bury. Old logbooks were stacked on the floor, faded company jackets hung on hooks, and framed newspaper clippings of the very first coal trucks lined the walls. Cal was sitting in a recliner, looking ancient but sharp-eyed. He didn't offer me tea. He just pointed to a wooden chair and asked, "You doing this to destroy Leonard, or to save what your granddad built?" I looked at the photos on the wall, black and white images of men standing proudly next to rigs that looked like toys compared to today's trucks. "My father is selling the company to a conglomerate that will strip it for parts," I said, my voice steady. "I'm doing this because I'm angry, yes, but mostly because Everett built this company to feed a town, not to feed a private equity firm. Cal studied me for a long, agonizing minute. He saw the anger, but he also saw the respect. Finally, he uncapped a pen. Your father already forgot where he came from. Maybe you'll remind this town. He signed the papers. Back in Chicago, Harper finalized the transfers. We sat in her glass-walled office watching a progress bar on her laptop. When it hit 100%, a confirmation window popped up. Current ownership stake 51.2%. I stared at the number. I felt a bizarre mix of exhilaration and nausea. It wasn't just a number, it was a loaded weapon. I legally controlled the board. I could fire Leonard. I could block the sale. I had the power to stop the train, but I knew doing so would derail my family forever. We spent the next 6 hours drafting the resolutions. We prepared a document canceling any pending sales, appointing an interim operations team, and naming me as the chair of the board. I also printed a brutal one-page summary of the company's real financial state, red ink, missed payments, the works. I put it all in a thick manila envelope. That night, Chris watched me pack my bag. They're going to say you betrayed them, Addie, he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. You know that, right? I zipped the bag shut. They betrayed me first, I replied, though my stomach twisted. And if I let them take the whole town down just so they don't feel embarrassed at dinner, that's on me. Which brings us back to the farmhouse. The transition from the cold Chicago wind to the stifling heat of the dining room was jarring. I took my seat at the far end of the table, past the cousins and the second-tier guests. The floral centerpiece was so large it physically cut off my view of the head of the table, blocking Leonard and Dylan from my sight unless I leaned to the side. It was petty, and it was perfect. The microaggressions started before the appetizers hit the table. My Aunt Linda leaned over, patting my hand with a pitying smile. It's so good you could make it, Adalynn. We know how busy you are with your independence. You don't need the company like Dylan does. Down the table, I heard Leonard laughing loudly with a local business owner. That's right, real work is done with your hands, not keyboards. You can't build a legacy on a laptop. A few people chuckled. A year ago, that would have crushed me. Tonight, the insults just bounced off. I knew the truth. I had already stripped them of the power they thought they were celebrating. They just didn't know it yet. Then came the moment. Leonard stood up and tapped his spoon against his glass. The room hushed. He gave a sentimental, rambling speech about sacrifice and keeping the Cole name on the trucks, words that felt hollow given the secret sale he was orchestrating. To secure our future, he announced, beaming, I am proud to name Adalynn Cole as the new CEO. We are aligning with a national partner to take us to the next level. Applause broke out. Dylan stood up, soaking it in, looking every bit the golden heir. Thanks, Dad, he said, smoothing his lapels. We're going to modernize. We're going to do some right-sizing, trim the fat, and move past the outdated ways. Trim the fat. I knew what that meant. He was talking casually about firing the people I had just visited, Marcia, Walt, the families I grew up with. My chest tightened. I laid my hand on the manila envelope resting in my lap. The texture of the paper felt rough against my fingertips. Leonard sat down, catching my eye. He looked annoyed that I wasn't clapping. He leaned forward, his voice a low growl that barely carried over the table. Don't you dare threaten this moment, Adalynn. I looked back at him, my pulse thundering in my ears, but my hand steady on the envelope. Oh, I'm not threatening it, I thought. I'm ending it. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The room went quiet, but not the respectful kind of silence that follows a prayer. It was the confused, heavy silence of a script going off the rails. I remained standing while everyone else held their glasses aloft, frozen in a tableau of forced celebration. My legs felt like they were filled with lead, but my voice when it came out was steady and loud enough to cut through the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Before everyone toasts, I said, my eyes locking onto my father's confused glare. There is something important you all should know about Cole hauling. Leonard's face darkened instantly. Adalynn, sit down. He hissed, his grip tightening on his wineglass. This is not the time for your attention-seeking. We are celebrating your brother. Beside him, Ruth looked mortified, her eyes darting to the church elders, as if begging them not to witness this breach of etiquette. Dylan just rolled his eyes, letting out a heavy, exaggerated sigh. "Jesus, Addie, can you let me have one night?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked the length of the table. The heels of my boots clicked rhythmically on the hardwood floor, a countdown clock ticking towards 0. I stopped directly between Leonard and Dylan, effectively breaking the visual bond they had shared all night. I held the manila envelope over the empty space on the tablecloth between them and let it drop. It landed with a sharp, heavy thud that made the silverware rattle. "Those are updated ownership records," I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room where the drivers sat. "Over the past year, while you were planning this announcement, I've been buying back the shares you forgot existed." Leonard stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he opened the clasp and slid the documents out. The color drained from his face in a wash of gray as his eyes scanned the summary sheet. He saw the transfers from Marcia, from Walt, from the cousins, and finally the signature from Cal Donnelly. "I now hold 51.2% of the voting stock of Cole Hauling and Fabrication," I announced to the room. I heard a collective gasp. "Legally, that means I decide whether this company is sold, and legally it means I decide who runs it." "Is that even legal?" someone whispered loudly from the side table. "It is," I answered, without looking away from my father. "And it's necessary." I turned to address the guests, the bankers, the drivers, the townspeople. My father and brother aren't just selling the company to a partner. They negotiated a sale to a conglomerate that plans to liquidate the local depot within 12 months. The modernization Dylan talked about. That's a polite word for bankruptcy restructuring. The debt is 3 times what they've told the bank. If this sale goes through, the pensions are gone, and this property becomes a parking lot. Dylan sputtered, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "You can't do this, Addie. They told me this was mine. They promised you the throne." I cut him off, my voice sharp as a whip. "But they built it out of my work and your denial." Leonard exploded. He slammed his fist onto the table, shaking the crystal glasses. "You ungrateful, treacherous child," he roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You city snake. You went behind my back to steal my legacy. If you go through with this, you are no daughter of mine." The words hung in the air, brutal and final. Ruth sobbed into her napkin. The guests looked down at their plates, terrified to move. But the words didn't hurt the way Leonard intended. They didn't break me. They freed me. "You already tried to erase me," I said, my voice shaking slightly but remaining clear. "You erased my ideas, my work, and my place in this family for 20 years. All I've done tonight is strip away the illusion that you earned this crown." I leaned in closer, so only he could see the resolve in my eyes. "You don't get to talk about sacrifice, Dad. Not when the only people you're willing to sacrifice are everyone but yourself." I straightened up and addressed the stunned room. "As the controlling shareholder, I am canceling the sale immediately. We will not be merging. I am bringing in an interim operations team starting Monday. There will be no mass layoffs. The restructuring will focus on cutting waste at the top, not the bottom." I glanced at Dylan, who looked like a deflated balloon. "I am formally calling for a board meeting next week. Until then, the role of CEO is under review." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. Behind me, I heard Leonard shouting my name, an impotent roar of a king who had just realized his castle was made of sand. Ruth was wailing. But I didn't look back. I stepped out the front door into the biting cold of the November night. The air was sharp and clean, scrubbing the scent of turkey and lies from my lungs. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a notification from the bank's automated system: "Alert, unexpected shareholder structure change detected." I stared at the screen, my breath pluming in the dark. The family war was over, but I realized with a sudden chilling clarity that the town war had just begun. By Friday, the narrative was everywhere, spreading through town faster than the flu. The story wasn't that I had saved the company from bankruptcy. It was that Adalynn Cole, the jealous city daughter, had returned to steal the family legacy right out from under her father's nose at Thanksgiving dinner. I felt the eyes on me everywhere I went. At the gas station, conversation died the moment I walked in. At church on Sunday, where I went mostly out of stubbornness, people whispered behind hymnals. I checked the local community Facebook page, once saw a comment claiming I had stripped them of everything out of spite, and closed the tab. I realized quickly that in a small town, truth is often less important than the comfort of a familiar hierarchy. And I had just broken the hierarchy. The atmosphere at the coal hauling depot on Monday morning was even worse. It was thick with fear. The workers didn't see a savior. They saw a takeover, a word they associated with corporate raiders and mass layoffs. When I walked through the mechanic bays, wrenches stopped turning. Men looked at their boots or glared at the wall. They thought I was the executioner. I knew I couldn't hide in the office. I called an immediate all-hands meeting in the break room. It was a dingy space smelling of stale coffee and diesel. Drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and office staff squeezed in their arms, crossed defensively. I didn't stand at the front of the room like a lecturer. I pulled a plastic milk crate into the center of the circle and stood on it so I could look them in the eye. "You've heard the rumors," I started, my voice ringing off the metal lockers. "You heard I came to erase this place. The truth is, I came because I'm the only one who refused to watch it die in silence." I didn't give a motivational speech. I gave them data. I projected the real numbers onto the whiteboard, the red ink, the delinquent loans, and the hidden clause in the sale documents Leonard had drafted that guaranteed the closure of this specific yard within a year. There was a murmur of shock. "I'm not here to hand out pink slips," I said, scanning the faces of men I'd known since I was a child. "I'm here to stop the sale that would have ended your jobs. We are bringing in modern routing software. We are buying safer trucks. And we are fixing the pay discrepancies." Jim Larkin, an older driver with grease permanently etched into his knuckles, spoke up from the back. "Your daddy says you're just chasing profit. He says you don't care about the people, just the bottom line." I looked right at him. "Jim, if I only cared about profit, I would have let the out-of-state buyers strip us for parts. That's where the quick money was. I'm here to stop that. The only thing I'm stripping is the lie they told you about this company's health." The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted. It went from hostility to skepticism, which was a start. But the personal attacks were just beginning. That evening, I came out to my rental car to find a note shoved under the windshield wiper. It was scrawled in marker on the back of a receipt. "Go back to Chicago before you ruin us." Later that night, Dylan showed up at my rental house. He was drunk, swaying on the porch, his eyes red-rimmed. He pounded on the door until I opened it. "You happy?" he slurred, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You stole my life, Addie. Everyone knows it." I leaned against the doorframe, feeling a wave of pity that quickly hardened into resolve. "I didn't steal your life, Dylan. I took away the fantasy that you earned it. You were handed everything I had to fight for, and you were about to let it all burn because you were too proud to ask for help." "I would have fixed it," he muttered, turning away. "I was the CEO." "You were a mascot," I said softly to his retreating back. "There's a difference." The real work began the next day with the arrival of Regina Morales. She was a veteran of 3 manufacturing turnarounds, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and zero patience for incompetence. I hired her as the interim COO. While I handled the banks and the legal fallout, Regina went to war on the operations floor. She implemented a new maintenance schedule that actually made sense. She renegotiated a vendor contract that had been bleeding us dry for years. Most importantly, she listened. Slowly, the ice began to crack. A line supervisor named Sarah Hodge, who had been cold to me all week, stopped by my office door on Thursday. She hesitated, then said, "The new safety gear Regina ordered, the guys noticed. They won't say it to your face yet, but they did notice. We haven't had new harnesses in 5 years." But for every win at the depot, the family Cold War deepened. Ruth called me on Friday night, weeping into the phone. She claimed I had broken Leonard that he wouldn't get out of bed. "How could you do this to your own father?" she wailed. My hand shook as I held the phone, guilt flaring hot and sharp. "You both broke me first, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "I just refused to stay broken." I ended the call before she could reply, staring at the wall for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. The week ended on a razor's edge. The local paper ran a front-page editorial painting me as a hostile outsider threatening the town's stability. It was a hit piece clearly influenced by Leonard's friends. But the next morning I opened the paper to the letters to the editor. It was stuffed. Some defended Leonard, calling me a traitor. But there were 2 letters from workers' wives defending the changes, mentioning the safety gear and the transparency. As I walked into the depot that Saturday to catch up on paperwork, Jim Larkin stopped me in the lot. He spat on the ground, looked at me, and adjusted his cap. "I still don't like what you did at that dinner," he grunted. "Disrespectful." He paused, looking at the new trucks lining up at the dock. "But if you keep the checks from bouncing, I'll back you in public. Just don't make me regret it." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even kindness, but it was a chance. The tide was turning inch by painful inch. The town hadn't accepted me, but they were starting to realize that the villain they chose might actually be the only one fighting for them. 1 year later, the walk through the coal-hauling depot felt entirely different. The air didn't smell like fear and stale diesel anymore. It smelled like fresh coffee and purpose. I walked past a row of newer trucks, their cabs gleaming under the bay lights, and watched a trainee shadow one of the older drivers checking the hydraulic lines with a seriousness that made me smile. The quarterly results on my tablet were green. Not the explosive fake growth Leonard had chased by leveraging our future, but modest, sustainable profit. We were off the distressed watch lists. We were exploring contracts that would expand our reach without selling out the town's soul. The company was alive, and for the first time in decades, it wasn't holding its breath. I stopped in the main hallway, standing before the wall that used to be a shrine to my father. For years, it had been dominated by a massive oil-painted portrait of Leonard looking imperious. That painting was gone now, gathering dust in his attic. In its place, I had commissioned a timeline. It was a mosaic of black and white photos featuring the drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers from every decade of the company's life. There was a photo of Marcia in the 80s, headset on, laughing. There was Walt covered in grease. And right in the center, there was a smaller, grainy picture I had recovered from an old album, me 6 years old, wearing a safety vest that hung down to my knees, holding a clipboard, while Grandpa Everett pointed at a manifest. I looked at that little girl and thought I didn't strip them of their legacy. I stripped them of the lie that the legacy belonged to one man's ego. My relationship with my family had shifted into a strange, polite new geometry. Leonard had attended the board meeting last week. It was the first time he'd set foot in the building since the coup. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He sat in the back row, hands folded on his lap. He looked smaller, the bluster deflated by reality. After the meeting, he approached me while I was packing up. It was awkward. He cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at my eyes, and muttered a halting, incomplete apology. He admitted he had underestimated the complexities of the market and that he didn't see what I was capable of. It wasn't a hug, and it wasn't love, but it was respect. That had to be enough. My mother, Ruth, was still keeping her distance, but she had sent a package a few days ago. It was a box of old certificates and ribbons. My debate team wins, my math league trophies, things she had packed away in the basement while displaying Dylan's participation awards on the mantel. There was a shaky note on top. "We were wrong not to see you. It was a start." And Dylan. Surprisingly, he was the one who had adapted best. He moved 2 towns over and took a job in regional sales for another logistics company. He wasn't the CEO, and nobody cared about his last name. He was hired on merit, and for the first time in his life, he was actually working. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Thanksgiving morning. A text from him. "Still think you went nuclear on us. Also, I'm better for it. Happy Turkey Day, boss." I smiled sadly. We were all growing, even if we were growing apart. But I wasn't spending Thanksgiving at the farmhouse this year. I was back in Chicago in my apartment with the view of the skyline. The dining table was a chaotic masterpiece of mismatched chairs I'd dragged in from the balcony and the bedroom. There was no seating chart. There was no staged announcement. Chris was in the kitchen carving the turkey, laughing as Harper tried to explain a legal precedent to him. Regina, my COO, was pouring wine for Sarah, Hodge, and Marcia, who had driven up from the town just for tonight. Two of the drivers were arguing good-naturedly about football on the sofa. It was loud, it was real, and it was filled with people who chose to be there. This was the American ideal. I believed in community second chances and building something together instead of just waiting to inherit it. I stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet, the cold wind biting at my cheeks. The city lights stretched out before me, a grid of millions of lives. I thought back to that walk up the driveway a year ago, the feeling of walking into a crime scene, the feeling of being erased. I realized now that my power hadn't come from buying the shares. The shares were just the mechanism. My power came from refusing to accept the role they had assigned to me. I looked out at the dark horizon and thought about everyone else who has ever felt like they were invisible in their own life. If your family or your boss or anyone else has tried to threaten your worth, to tell you your place is at the edge of the table, that doesn't make it true. They can try to erase you. They can try to strip you down to the version of you that makes them comfortable. But they don't get the final edit. They thought the best way to control me was to erase me. Instead, they taught me how to build a life where their approval doesn't decide if I get a seat. Inside, Chris called my name, raising a glass. "To the boss!" Everyone cheered. I turned back toward the warmth and the light. "My name is Adalynn Cole. I am the daughter they tried to erase, the woman who stripped them of their illusion of control, and the one who decided that if there wasn't a place for me at their table, I'd just build my own." And that is where we leave Adalynn, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be erased. What do you think? Did she go too far with her family, or was it the only way to save the town? Let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.